A man on horseback rips off his helmet and screams a single word across the battlefield. Wa Islama, my Islam. His army is breaking. The Mongol cavalry, the same force that burned Baghdad, that drowned 1,000,000 books, that has never lost a battle in the open field, is pushing through the center line. Everything is collapsing. And this man, a former slave who was once sold in a market for 400 silver coins, is the only thing standing between the Mongol Empire and the rest of the world. What happens in the next 30 minutes will change history forever. Last episode, we watched the Mongol Empire erase Baghdad, the most advanced city on Earth, in 13 days. We watched the Tigris run black with the ink of 1,000,000 destroyed books, and the question everyone was left with was, did anyone ever fight back? The answer is yes. 2 years after Baghdad fell, at a place called Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel, an army did something no military force on the planet had managed in over 50 years of Mongol conquest. They beat them. In open battle. No tricks of geography, no hiding behind castle walls. Face-to-face, cavalry against cavalry, on an open plain. And here's the part that makes it almost unbelievable. The men who did it were former slaves, bought as boys from markets across Central Asia, trained since childhood to fight, and forged into the most elite warrior caste the medieval world had ever seen. They were called the Mamluks. This is the story of how they did the impossible. To understand Ain Jalut, you first need to understand the Mamluks. And to understand the Mamluks, you need to forget everything you think you know about slavery. In the medieval Islamic world, there was a military institution unlike anything in Western history. Rulers, particularly in Egypt, would buy young boys, usually Turkic or Circassian, from the slave markets of Central Asia and the Black Sea region. These boys, typically between 8 and 14 years old, were taken from their families, sometimes sold by their own parents during famines, and shipped to Egypt. And then something strange happened. They weren't sent to work fields or build monuments. They were sent to school, military school, the most intense, comprehensive military training program in the medieval world. These boys, called Mamluks, from the Arabic word meaning one who is owned, were trained in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, lance combat, and military tactics. The training lasted years. It was brutal. Many didn't survive it, but those who did emerged as something extraordinary. Elite mounted warriors with a level of skill that no army in Europe or Asia could match on an individual basis. Think of it as the Spartan Agoj, but instead of free citizens being hardened, it was enslaved children being transformed into the most lethal cavalry force on the planet. And here's the twist that makes the whole system so strange and so fascinating. Once a Mamluk completed his training, he was freed, legally emancipated. He became a free man, a soldier, and critically, a member of the military ruling class. The very system that enslaved these boys also elevated them to the top of society. Former slaves became generals. Former slaves became sultans. The entire ruling dynasty of Egypt was composed of men who had once been someone else's property. It was a system that was simultaneously monstrous and meritocratic, cruel and transformative. Now, by the year 1259, 2 former slave boys had risen to the very top of this system, and they despised each other. The first was Qutuz. Sold into slavery as a boy, probably of Turkic origin, Qutuz had climbed the Mamluk ranks through a combination of military talent and political ruthlessness. When the previous sultan proved too weak to face the Mongol threat, Qutuz overthrew him and seized the throne himself, not through inheritance, not through election, through a palace coup backed by the sword. He was, by every measure, an illegitimate ruler, but he was also the only man in Egypt willing to actually confront what was coming from the east. The second was Baybars, and Baybars is one of the most remarkable human beings of the 13th century, possibly of the entire medieval period. Sold as a slave in the markets of Damascus, likely of Kipchak Turkic origin, taken from the steppes north of the Black Sea as a boy, Baybars had risen through the Mamluk ranks with terrifying speed. He was tall, powerfully built, and reportedly had a distinctive cataract in one eye that made him look perpetually fierce. He was a military genius, aggressive, creative, fearless in combat, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to read a battlefield. He had already helped defeat a Crusader army at the Battle of Al-Mansura in 1250. He was also ambitious, cunning, and utterly without scruples. Baybars wanted the throne. He believed he deserved the throne, and Qutuz knew it. So, here's the situation. Egypt is the last major Islamic power standing. Baghdad is ash. Syria has fallen. Damascus and Aleppo are under Mongol control. The Mongol general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian commanding a mixed force of Mongols, Armenians, and Georgian troops, is camped in Syria with his army, preparing for the push south into Egypt. And the only thing between the Mongol Empire and total domination of the Islamic world is an Egyptian army led by two former slaves who might murder each other before the enemy even arrives. This is where the story gets personal, because Qutuz needed Baybars. Baybars was the best field commander he had, possibly the best in the entire Islamic world. But giving Baybars the vanguard meant putting a knife in the hands of the one man most likely to use it on you. Qutuz made his choice. He gave Baybars the vanguard. He bet everything on the gamble that Baybars hated the Mongols more than he hated him. At least for now.
Then the Mongol ambassadors arrived in Cairo. They carried Hulagu's standard demand: submit, tear down your walls, or be annihilated. The same message Baghdad had received. Every ruler who had received this letter before had done one of two things: surrender or die. Qutuz did neither. He had the ambassadors executed. He cut off their heads and mounted them on the gates of Cairo. It was the most provocative act any ruler had committed against the Mongol Empire. There was no going back.
To appreciate just how insane Qutuz's decision was, you need to understand what the Mongols had done to the last people who defied them. Baghdad, leveled. Population, massacred. Caliph, trampled to death in a carpet. Aleppo, stormed, sacked, population enslaved or killed. Damascus, surrendered immediately. The people of Damascus watched what happened to Aleppo and chose survival. Every Islamic power west of Persia had either submitted or been destroyed. And now Qutuz, a former slave ruling a country through a military coup, had just executed the ambassadors of the most powerful empire on the planet. He hadn't just refused to submit, he'd made it personal. In the entire history of the Mongol Empire, almost no one had dared to kill their ambassadors. It was considered the ultimate provocation, a guarantee of total annihilation. The last ruler who killed Mongol ambassadors was the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire. The Mongols responded by erasing his entire civilization from the face of the earth. Qutuz knew this history. He did it anyway. But Qutuz understood something that the Caliph of Baghdad hadn't. You cannot negotiate with an empire that interprets negotiation as weakness. The Mongol system was binary: submit or be destroyed. There was no middle path. If you were going to die either way, you might as well die fighting, and maybe, just maybe, fighting was the one option nobody expected. And then Qutuz caught a break, a massive, world-altering break.
In August 1259, Great Khan Mongke died during the campaign against Song dynasty China. His death triggered a succession crisis that rippled across the entire Mongol Empire. Hulagu, the destroyer of Baghdad, the man who had been preparing to crush Egypt with the full weight of his army, was forced to pull back the bulk of his forces east to secure his claim in the succession struggle. He left behind a smaller garrison force in Syria under General Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian Mongol, a veteran commander, and a man who had personally overseen the sack of Baghdad and multiple other cities. Kitbuka was no lightweight. He was a hardened killer with decades of experience, but he was also now operating alone, without the full weight of the Mongol Empire behind him. Kitbuka's force was still formidable. Estimates range from 10 to 20,000 troops, Mongol cavalry plus Armenian and Georgian Christian allies who had their own reasons for fighting alongside the invaders, but it was a fraction of what Hulagu could have brought. And this is where the moral complexity deepens, because Kitbuka wasn't just a Mongol general, he was a Christian, fighting in a region where Christians had been a persecuted minority under Islamic rule for centuries. Some of the local Christian communities, Armenians, Georgians, certain Maronite and Nestorian groups, actively supported the Mongol invasion, seeing it as liberation from Muslim domination. The Crusader states, still clinging to a thin strip of coast, were caught in an impossible position. The Mongols were destroying their Muslim enemies, which seemed like good news, but the Mongols were also clearly planning to destroy everyone eventually, which was very much not good news. The Crusaders ultimately chose neutrality. They allowed the Mamluk army to pass through their territory unmolested, and even provided supplies at some points. It was a decision that may have decided the fate of the battle, and one the Crusaders would live to regret, because the Mamluks had long memories. So here's the chessboard in September 1260. Kitbuka is in the Galilee region with his garrison force, confident in the Mongol reputation, but dangerously isolated. Qutuz is marching north from Egypt with the full Mamluk army, probably around 20,000 strong, the best trained cavalry in the Islamic world. Baybars is commanding the vanguard, scouting ahead with a smaller force of elite cavalry, and the entire future of the Islamic world, and possibly the trajectory of global civilization, depends on what happens when these forces collide in a valley near a spring called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, named, according to tradition, after the place where the giant Goliath fell. If you were writing fiction, you couldn't invent more perfect setting for a story about an underdog facing an invincible giant. Except this isn't fiction, and unlike the Bible story, nobody watching in September 1260 thought the underdog had a chance.
On September 3rd, 1260, Baybars and his vanguard made contact with the Mongol forward scouts. The skirmishing began. And then Baybars did something that was either brilliant or suicidal. He attacked Kitbuka's army with his smaller force and then turned and ran. He was baiting the Mongols into the valley, using their own tactic, the feigned retreat, against them. The Mongols took the bait. Kitbuka ordered a full pursuit. His entire army charged into the valley of Ain Jalut, and the hills on both sides were full of hidden Mamluk cavalry, waiting. The Mongols realized the trap too late. As Kitbuka's cavalry poured into the valley, Qutuz sprung the ambush. Mamluk heavy cavalry crashed into the Mongol flanks from both sides of the valley simultaneously. The hills that had looked empty moments before erupted with armored horsemen. The sound must have been apocalyptic. Thousands of horses, the crash of metal on metal, war drums, and the screams of men and animals. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army was surrounded. But the Mongols were the Mongols. They didn't panic. They didn't break. Kidbuka rallied his troops with terrifying discipline and fought back with everything the Mongol military machine could deliver. The battle wasn't a quick rout, it was a grinding, savage, hours-long fight that could have gone either way at multiple points. The Mongol cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the world, warriors who learned to ride before they could walk, wheeled and countercharged with the precision of men who had been winning battles their entire lives. Kidbuka himself was everywhere on the battlefield, personally leading charges into the Mamluk lines, rallying units that wavered, refusing to accept that this battle was any different from the 100 victories that came before it. And at several points during the battle, the Mongols actually pushed the Mamluks back, hard. The center of the Mamluk line buckled, units started to waver, and this is the moment that changed everything. Qutuz, the Sultan of Egypt, the former slave boy who had seized his throne through a coup, saw his army beginning to crack, and he did something that sultans were not supposed to do. He rode to the front line himself. He threw off his helmet so his troops could see his face, and he screamed, the accounts agree on this single detail, he screamed, "Wa Islama, O my Islam," and charged directly into the Mongol lines. A sultan, on the front line, leading from the front, not commanding from the rear. This was not how medieval warfare worked. Generals commanded from safe positions behind the lines. They directed strategy. They did not personally charge into the teeth of a Mongol counterattack. But Qutuz wasn't a normal general. He was a former slave who had seized a throne to fight this exact battle, and he was not going to lose it from a command tent. His personal guard followed. The wavering units saw their sultan, a man they knew had risen from nothing, a man who had once been property just like them, charging into the most dangerous point on the battlefield, and something shifted deep in their ranks. The line held. Then it pushed forward. Then it started to break the Mongol formation. The Mamluks' greatest advantage now came into play. These were men who had trained for this their entire lives. Since they were boys of 8 or 9 years old, they drilled on horseback, perfected archery at full gallop, and practiced close-quarters mounted combat until it was muscle memory. The Mongols were formidable, but the Mamluks were specialists. And in a prolonged close-quarters cavalry engagement, specialization mattered. Hour by hour, the tide turned. The discipline that had carried the Mongols across continents began to crack under the relentless pressure of the Mamluk counterattack. The Mongol flanks began to collapse. Units that had never retreated in their lives started falling back. Kidbuka refused to retreat. Whether out of honor, duty, or the knowledge that Hulagu would execute him for failure, Kidbuka fought until he was surrounded and captured. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting. Others say he was brought before Qutuz in chains and executed on the spot. Either way, the result was the same. The Mongol army at Ain Jalut was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. Scattered, killed, or captured. The force that had terrorized the world for 50 years was broken in a valley named after a fallen giant. The myth of Mongol invincibility, the psychological weapon that had been as powerful as any sword or siege engine, was shattered. They could bleed, they could lose, they could die. For 50 years, armies had surrendered to the Mongols because they believed resistance was hopeless. After Ain Jalut, that belief was dead.
The Mongols never came back for Egypt. Ain Jalut didn't just win a battle, it drew a permanent line. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered everything from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, was stopped in a valley in modern-day Israel by an army of former slaves. The western expansion of the Mongol Empire, the expansion that had devoured Persia, Iraq, and Syria, ended here. But the story doesn't end with a victory parade, because remember Baybars, the brilliant, ruthless general who had commanded the vanguard, who had executed the feigned retreat that lured the Mongols into the trap, the man who arguably won the battle. He wanted his reward. He asked Qutuz for the governorship of Aleppo. Qutuz refused, possibly because he feared Baybar's ambition, possibly because he didn't trust him, possibly because he was right not to. Less than a month after Ain Jalut, on October 24, 1260, while the victory celebrations were still fresh, Baybars and a group of conspirators ambushed Qutuz during a hunting trip in the Sinai. They killed him. Baybars took the throne. The man who had saved Egypt was murdered by the man who had helped him save it. And here's the part that makes this story so much more complicated than a simple triumph. Baybars became one of the greatest sultans in Egyptian history. He built the Mamluk Sultanate into a regional superpower. He drove the Crusaders out of most of their remaining strongholds. He established a diplomatic network that stretched from Europe to the Mongol successor states. He was a visionary ruler who transformed Egypt into a regional superpower, built fortifications that still stand today, established a postal system that connected his empire, and created diplomatic relations that shaped the medieval Mediterranean. And also a murderer who killed the man he owed everything to. History doesn't do clean heroes. Ain Jalut's legacy extends far beyond one battle. By stopping the Mongol advance, the Mamluks preserved Egypt, North Africa, and the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina from destruction. They preserved what remained of Islamic scholarship and institutions. They created the political stability that allowed trade routes to flourish for the next 2.5 centuries. And on a global scale, Ain Jalut is one of the key reasons the Mongol Empire fractured into competing successor states, rather than remaining a single superpower. The myth of invincibility was the glue that held that empire together. Armies surrendered without fighting because they believed resistance was pointless. Once the myth broke at Ain Jalut, the fractures followed, and within decades, the unified Mongol Empire was gone, replaced by competing khanates that would never reassemble. The world we live in today, a world of multiple competing civilizations rather than one dominant empire, owes something to a September morning in 1260 when a former slave threw off his helmet and charged.
There's something worth sitting with in this story. The man who saved the Islamic world was a slave. He was taken from his home as a child, sold as property, and trained to kill. The system that created him was brutal and dehumanizing, and yet, within that system, he found a way to do something no free king, no hereditary sultan, no born and raised prince had managed to do. He beat the unbeatable. The uncomfortable truth is that history's greatest moments often come from history's most broken people. The hero of Ain Jalut wasn't some chosen one born to greatness. He was a product of a machine designed to turn children into weapons, and when the world needed a weapon, he was ready. That doesn't make the machine good, but it makes the man extraordinary.
So here's my question for the comments. Qutuz saved Egypt. Baybars murdered him and built an empire on the victory. Who's the real hero of this story? Is it the man who sacrificed everything to win the battle, or the man who made sure the victory actually lasted? I want to hear your take. Drop it below. Now, you remember how I mentioned the Crusader states, the ones that let the Mamluk army pass through their territory on the way to Ain Jalut? That decision to stay neutral might have been the biggest mistake in the history of the Crusades, because Baybars didn't forget that the Crusaders were there, and he didn't forget that they were weak. What he did to the Crusader states over the next 2 decades is one of the most methodical campaigns of conquest in medieval history. Fortresses that had stood for 150 years fell one by one. The Crusaders lost everything, and the way they lost it tells you everything about why empires collapse. That story, the real end of the Crusades, the part your school never taught you, is our next episode. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. This is History Rewind. I'll see you in the next one.